So hi, everyone. I'm Amy Mobby, Education Manager at Jenkins Arboretum and Gardens. We're so glad that you could join us for tonight's lecture, Cultivating Soil Health with Mark Highland. Tonight's lecture is the final event in our summer-long Arboretum community read. Arboretum is in its third year and is a partnership between Jenkins Arboretum and Gardens and Tredyffrin Public Library. We have Marianne Cooper on with us tonight, and she's in charge of adult programming and community outreach at the Tredyffrin Public Library and has been my co-host for the 2023 partnership. During Arboretum, we provide opportunities to promote literacy and community conversations in Tredyffrin Township. From July 1st through August 18th, which is already tomorrow, we have been reading Love, Nature, Magic, Shamanic Journeys into the Heart of My Garden by Maria Rodale. In Love, Nature, Magic, Maria combines her love of gardening and nature with her experience in shamanic journeying, embarking on an epic adventure to learn from plants, animals, and insects, including some of the most misunderstood beings in nature. And we can't wait to discover another often misunderstood part of nature tonight, soil. Now to introduce our presenter for tonight's lecture, Mark Highland. It was on a beautiful piece of Illinois farmland that Mark pushed his first shovel into garden soil. After he grew up, Mark focused his master's degree studies in the Longwood graduate program on compost and potting soil. After the Longwood graduate program, Mark started the Organic Mechanics Soil Company in 2006 and serves as president of Organic Mechanics. Mark has served as a consultant for the EPA and Institute for Local Self-Reliance. Mark is the author of the book, Practical Organic Gardening, the No-Nonsense Guide to Growing Naturally. And I must say, I got it off my bookshelf to show tonight. And so at this point, I will turn things over to Mark to get us started.
Right on. Thanks, Amy. I have to sign it for you the next time I see you.
Yeah, most definitely.
And thank you for asking me to present tonight on cultivating soil health. I think that it fits pretty well with the Arboretum program that you all were running. And, because soils are commonly misunderstood. And, the most basic misunderstanding, because everyone grows up calling it dirt, right? It's dirt. There's dirt in the garden. Well, I hope by the end of this talk, you all understand why many of us call it soil, not dirt, right? So I always crack the joke for me. Dirt is what's under your fingernails after a good day of gardening. And dirt is what you tracked into the house as a kid and got scolded by your mom or your grandmom or whoever. Soil is alive, and we'll come to talk about that. But, in general, we're going to talk about cultivating soil health. And, we have a great quote by Wendell Berry here, and then two images from Philadelphia. The one on our left is the view of City Hall from the old Love Park, and which of course was redone, but the picture on the right is 30th Street Station. Those very large planters around 30th Street Station are all full of organic mechanics. A lot of places in Philly use organic mechanics potting soil in the large containers you see in Philadelphia, including the ones all the way down Broad Street. Anyway, so we're going to, this slide is about perspective. And please put your questions in the Q&A. I hear your questions. So we'll have time for questions at the end. This talk is my perspective on soil, right? So I used the image of me at night showing these shadows. I just thought the shadows looked really cool. I saw it one night and I was like, ooh, that could be my perspective slide. I have, about 30 years professional experience in horticulture, and a lot of it focused on soils and soils from a gardener's perspective and also from a professional horticulture perspective. But it's a sum of my experiences, right? So what you'll hear from me you might hear a differing opinion in a book. Yes. Oh no. It is what it is. Gardeners have different opinions sometimes. I would say that all of my perspective is based on scientific fact that I've read, or experiences that I've had, or experiences that other gardeners have shared with me. Part of the joy of being a gardener is talking with other gardeners and learning from other gardeners. And when I was in my younger days, interning and such, I ate that up as much as possible. I love talking to gardeners that knew more than me, because you can learn a lot from another gardener. So this is my perspective on soils and soils management, cultivating soil health in the garden, and why, as we'll learn, soil is actually alive. I love including this slide because it was drawn by a fifth grader. And if fifth graders can understand what the world would be like without trees, I think we as adults can also get it. A very pretty place. We had no trees on this planet. And so, we need to take care of our ecosystems. We need to cherish our ecosystems. And nature is all around us when we are outside. There's scientific proof that, hey, if you can hear a bird, if you can feel the breeze on your face, if you can see a tree, and I don't care if it's a street tree or a park tree, or you are in nature. And there are so many benefits to being in nature, but again, it's just a quick slide to make everyone smile and say, look, if a fifth grader can understand it, we can all understand it too. Plants and trees are important, and the plants and trees directly impact our soil health and the growth of carbon in soil, et cetera. So we'll go to all that. So we're going to start off talking about soil formation so that everyone understands that you can't just make soil in your backyard. Because we're mostly going to talk about soil in the ground, the landscape soils, which is not the same as potting soil. And we'll talk about the differences between potting. But soil itself is topsoil. I'm not talking about amended subsoil either. And we'll talk about the differences between those. But the topsoil is at the top of the soil profile near the surface, and the subsoil is down below. Okay. But soil is made of rocks, essentially. Rocks weather, meaning they break down. Whether it's chemical, environmental, rocks are constantly breaking down. And when rocks break down into smaller and smaller and smaller particles, we end up with soil. And it takes hundreds to thousands of years to make an inch of soil. It's different depending on where you are around the world. This process happens faster in certain climates, slower in certain climates. So it depends on the parent material, because different parent material, meaning different rocks, gives rise to different types of soil. So the point is, it takes a long time to make topsoil. Topsoil is sand, silt, and clay. We'll talk more about that too. A lot of people look at soil and they say, oh, is soil color an indicator of how good it is, right? When we think of compost, it's dark and chocolatey black. And when we think of topsoil, you might immediately think the darker the soil, the better it's going to be. In general, it can mean that it could be high in organic matter, could be high in other substances as well. But color alone does not tell you if it's a good soil or not. If a soil is very red in color, it just means it has a lot of iron oxides present. But the bottom line is that you have to be really familiar with local soil types in order to know if that soil color is good or bad for your given area. So a lot of people ask me about unscreened versus screened topsoil. When you buy topsoil, if you need topsoil for a project at your home, most of the soil companies sell screened topsoil. Some of them sell unscreened topsoil as well. There is a arborist, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on his name. I'll have it in another second. James Urban is a pretty famous arborist, and he did a lot of trials looking at screened topsoil versus unscreened topsoil. Is there a difference in tree growth? And the bottom line, once there was not a difference between those two, whether it's screened or not, and actually screened it a little bit worse, but it was more related to the volume of soil. How big the trees got was directly related to the volume of soil that they had. So this means if you're planting a tree in a pot, for example, the bigger pot you can give it, the better off that tree is going to be. The more room there is for its roots, the more room it is for water holding capacity in that pot. But so a little bit about screen versus unscreened. And sometimes at these soil companies, when they produce screened topsoil, if they screen it in the rain or when it's wet, it'll look like little tiny pebbles of soil when it delivers to your driveway, if you get it in bulk. And that's not exactly great for making soil structure, which we're going to talk about building soil structure, because that is the key to building soil health. Cultivating soil health is to build soil structure, right? So when it comes to soils, you definitely want to keep it on site whenever possible. I understand there are some concerns people have about things like heavy metals. All those issues can be addressed, but in general, you always want to keep soil on site just because it's so expensive. And think of how many hundreds of years it took to create, the 8 inches or maybe even the 4 inches of topsoil that you have. So you want to keep soil on site whenever possible, even if it requires blending for a different use. Now, if you're growing edibles, that's something different. We'll talk about that later on. But so soil formation, it takes a long time. So as I like to call the soul of soil, you have 3 major properties: physical properties, chemical properties, and biological properties. And texture is a big one, as it is directly related to the amount of sand, silt, and clay in your soil. And texture is a large driver in the types of plants that you would look to put in the garden, based on the texture of soil that you have. And in Southeast Pennsylvania, where I'm guessing a lot of you live, as I do, we have a lot of silty clay around here, which is a pretty decent topsoil, pretty decent soil overall. And we'll talk more about each of these in coming slides. Physical properties is up first, and then we're going to go over the chemical properties of soil, and then the biological properties of soil. And you can see the biological properties is the biggest section. Well, they're all very important to understanding how to cultivate soil, but I'm big on the biological properties, so we'll talk about all those things. When we're cultivating soil, we're building soil structure. We build soil structure, which is the ability for the soil to moisture, hold nutrients, right? When a soil has good structure, it can accept the rain that falls from the sky and it won't run off. That's important. When it has good structure, it doesn't erode as fast when it's hit by raindrops. It can suppress disease because of the functioning soil ecosystem. It can retain more nutrients. It can even help plants out by inducing a systemic response from the microbial activity happening in the soil. And this plant systemic response that I'm referring to is the ability of plants to sense certain signals in the soil so they know whether they should amp up the amount of phytochemicals in their leaves, protect themselves against insects. There's so many wonderful things that happen when you have a well-functioning soil ecosystem, because in a functioning soil ecosystem, you have a very diverse and abundant subset of soil biology. So these are characteristics of functioning soil ecosystems. We're going to come back to them at the end. The image itself was one just showing it's fungal hyphae from a potting soil, very active potting soil. And it is, this is taken from a really high power microscope, but you can kind of see the septate. If I move my mouse, I forget if you all can see my mouse or not, but I'm just pointing, there's a wall in between these 2 fungal cells here. And that just means it's a different particular type class of fungi. There are some fungi that don't have any walls, any septa, and they're just like a pure straw. So it's how to tell them apart under a microscope, which can be super fun, but also very time consuming to learn all the differences. But Tells you a lot about the biological health of your soil, being able to look at it under a microscope. You can send off for this kind of testing. It's fairly expensive. Sometimes you can find a local event happening. Various farming associations sometimes have these events where you can bring in your soil and they'll take a look at it and tell you the overall health of the soil. But regardless, we're going to learn about the characteristics of these functioning soil ecosystems. To create them, sorry, I got to move my little. Create the functioning soil ecosystem. You know, we are gifted with the soil that we have, and that soil has certain physical, chemical, and biological properties. It's really hard to change the physical properties. You can change the chemical properties over time. Biological properties can be changed by adding organic matter. Most soils are degraded, meaning they have less organic matter than they should. Organic matter is part of a soil test. So we'll talk about soil testing in a minute. I absolutely encourage all of you to get your soil tested so you know what baseline you're working with. But adding organic matter is one of the best things you can do to bring functionality back to the soil, especially when we talk about garden soils, meaning perennial gardens, ornamental plants, vegetable gardens, and turf grass, any kind of grass. Organic matter really helps in these situations to hold our nutrients in the soil, as well as to help build soil structure, complexing between the clay particles, the organic matter, and the microbes in soil. One big component of creating functional soil ecosystems is to stop tilling. Now, believe it or not, there is more and more no-till or reduced tillage farming going on in the US on the commercial scale. When we till in a garden, and believe me, I know so many books talk about tilling, and I'm sure I used to till a vegetable garden every spring. And as I learned more and more about the soil food web and creating some functional soil ecosystems, I learned that when we till, we reduce the soil structure, we reduce the soil porosity, we break up the fungal network in our soils that is a superhighway of water and nutrients being transferred from the soil into the plants. So we really want to eliminate or limit tillage in soils to preserve the structure and therefore some of the functionality of the soil ecosystems. We want to plant more plants. The more plants we have, the more soil carbon and the more microbial growth we're encouraging. So now I know that native bees need earth to dig into to build their nests. So I'm not saying all open soil is bad, but I'm saying, hey, the more plants, the better in a garden, plant to plant, using plants as mulch. But plants are the best at putting carbon in the ground. They produce incredible amount of root exudates as they grow, and those exudates are in the soil. They're food for microbes. And those microbes are called, it's like almost like, I sometimes say it's like, you know, when someone's cooking cookies in the kitchen, everyone's like, oh, it smells good in the kitchen. Let's go. It's the same thing with the microbes. They can sense, they can smell these compounds that are outside of the roots, and they're drawn to it. So it encourages microbial growth. The more plants you have, the more roots are going into the soil, the more carbon that's going into the soil. And also when we stop tilling, we're going to limit, and we limit compaction as well. That's really the way we build soil structure. And we're going to start talking more about that and the physical properties of soil. But it's all of these things come together to create the functional soil ecosystem. So we have to understand the different parts in order to build from there. Compost is my favorite soil amendment. Absolutely my favorite. Make it in your backyard. If you can't make enough, and it's hard to make enough compost to use in a decent sized garden, you can always find it at your local garden center. Or maybe your friend makes compost. Right? Compost is my number one. And it has a lot of pros. It has very little cons. However, You do need to understand, I think you all probably do as gardeners, compost source quality varies. Not all composts are made the same. And I say, hey, not all pizza is made the same, right? There are some really great sources of compost, and there's some not so great sources of compost. And it really comes down to the management practices when they're making the compost. I am a unabashedly lazy composter, meaning I have a static pile that I turn about once a year. But I add my greens to my pile, and I add my browns, my carbon source, on top at a 2-to-1 ratio. And that's about it. It doesn't go to the landfill. It breaks down in the backyard. And in the long run, it makes some beautiful looking compost. And that's called a static pile. But for those of you that want compost faster, you can turn your piles to make it faster. We're not really we can have a whole class on making compost, but I'm going to assume you all probably know what compost is. That's my definition of compost after doing my master's thesis on composting. And in general, application rate, especially for turf, if you want to do a 1/2-inch layer 1 time a year, you need about 1.5 cubic yards to treat 1,000 square feet. Okay? And the best time to add compost to a turf grass area, no matter how big it is, would be after you core aerate. But even if you don't aerate, the compost will still work its way down in there. But you do want to make sure that it's screened. You really don't want anything bigger than particles of a 1/2 inch that you're going to fling out over your turf. And it's super fun. You get your bulk delivery, and you put it in a wheelbarrow, you wheelbarrow to where you're going, get a shovel's worth, and you just fling it. Like you're taking a tennis swing, and it will, for the most part, you get about a 1/2 inch application, and you do it about 100 times, you get pretty good at it. But there's other ways you can put it down with a spreader. You can have a commercial application, a commercial landscaper put that down for you, but it's one way to do it. Biochar is an amazing soil amendment. And if you have not heard about it yet, I recommend you look into it. It's carbon, highly porous carbon, improves nutrient absorption and provides this home for beneficial biology. Biochar is based on the terra preta soils of the Amazon. There's whole BBC documentaries on it. Has a lot of pros in the garden, has a couple cons, meaning, hey, source quality still varies. It is hard to find, but it is out there. There's a lot of suppliers of biochar if you go looking. A lot of people think that all biochars are the same, and they're really not. It comes down to what they're made from, what temperature they're made at. And you want a high carbon biochar. Technically, biochar is not supposed to be called biochar in the US unless it's over 60% carbon. And that has to do with, again, what it's made from, how it's made. But you can make it from anything that was organic matter. The most common thing is wood chip. They make it from chicken litter. You can make it from biosolids. You can make it from straw. You can make it from miscanthus. You can make it from a lot of different things. Even wood pellets can be turned into biochar. But wood-based biochar is one of the best, in my humble opinion. And that's because of the high carbon content that it contains, the incredible porosity that it has, and also low pH for biochar. A wood-based biochar is on the lower pH side, which is good for the garden. So I kind of have to leave it there on biochar. If you have more questions about it, absolutely ask. Hopefully I'm opening up a rabbit hole for you to go into over the weekend and just do a deep dive into what biochar is, and maybe you'll find some for your garden. I highly recommend you try it though, because of its incredible effects on plants and really the soil, building soil structure and making more functional ecosystems. The big difference between biochar and compost, biochar is permanent, practically permanent. It's going to last a lifetime after you put it down, whereas compost oxidizes rather quickly. And if you have a raised bed and you put a lot of compost in it and it shrinks on you and you see that the soil level is going down over the years, that's because the compost is oxidizing, it's breaking down. All organic matter oxidizes and breaks down over time. Biochar is unique in that that carbon structure that's created during the heat process, it's very recalcitrant, so it just doesn't break down, and it'll be sticking around for years and years. You know, again, we don't say our biochar lasts 2,000 years, but the USDA went to the Amazon, tested the carbon, and that's the carbon that is there is 2,000 years old. So we like to say it lasts a lifetime. We're not going to say it's last 2,000, but it will last a long time. It doesn't oxidize the way compost does. So it's a permanent source of organic matter, and it does so much more than just organic matter for soils. So a quick summary on that, you know, compost and biochar can modify physical, chemical, and biological properties of soil. It has the greatest effect on poor soils. So if you put biochar into the volcanic soils of the Pacific Northwest, you'll have a little bit of a gain, again, because it's permanent, but that's already a pretty decent soil. If you talk about the sandy soils of the coastal plain, no matter what state you're talking about, biochar and compost has a huge effect on that sandy soil to retain moisture and retain nutrients and really help out plants and plant growth. The characteristics of the product will directly influence the potential for benefit because, again, they're not all made equal. So you have to make sure you have a good supply. It can increase water retention in dry soils and increase drainage in heavy soil. It can decrease nutrient losses as a permanent home for microbes. A quick example of how it can increase drainage in heavy soil. Chanticleer Gardens, one of our customers at Organic Mechanics, they've been using our biochar for a long time, over a decade, and the various projects in the garden. But one of the gardeners, Prashemik, who's in the woods, he had a problem area that poor drainage, plants weren't doing well. So he decided to try a biochar surface application, and then he put a 3-inch layer of mulch, wood chip, on top of that. And this is an area where he couldn't even get a trowel into. 1 year later, no other work, no air spading, no tilling, no nothing. He could move the remaining wood chips that were still there aside, and he could get a trowel down into the soil. Biochar helped to open up, almost flocculate that heavy soil to break up the compaction. And it does that in a number of ways. Biochar can be an electron donor or acceptor to drive reactions. It's really just an amazing amendment. But quick summary, because these are my 2 favorite soil amendments. So potting soil versus soil. This is a big one. A lot of people don't know that potting soil is not soil. It has no soil in it whatsoever. These bags that you see at the store, they have marketing terms. This is garden soil. This is planting soil. It's really all about the ingredients. But potting soil is typically a soil-less media. No sand, silt, clay. Usually peat, perlite, vermiculite, can have coconut coir or aged bark. Pine bark is a big thing. You know, you can have earthworm castings or rice hulls. Topsoil is very different. Topsoil is sand, silt, and clay, rocks, tiny rocks. So topsoil was never alive because it's made of rocks. So technically there is no such thing as organic topsoil. There's organic matter in topsoil, but topsoil is made of rocks, and rocks were never alive. So, but topsoil itself, so incredibly important for our plants. It holds water and airspace in the root zone. It's an anchor for plants, and it holds the nutrients that plants need. So again, you really have to read the label to know what you're buying and what it's for. You know, these are just some images of potting soil in pots, soil in the ground, and then some potting soil at the hemp farm at the Pocono Raceway, Pocono Organics, which is directly involved with the Rodale Institute. Soil texture. All right, now we're going to start getting into some details, which is super fun, right? Texture, to find out what type of soil you have. Test for physical properties. You can do a classic soil ribbon test. If you Google, you know, soil ribbon test, you're going to get the instructions on how to essentially take a little bit of your garden soil, you add a little bit of water to it, and you try to see how big of a ribbon you can make by pushing that soil out with your thumb. And the longer you can make the ribbon, the more clay content in your soil. I really love the jar test. So you take about, in a small jar, about a cup of soil, and then fill the jar up with water, shake it really good, and then just let it sit on the counter for a while. It does require doing some math and measuring with a ruler, but the sand settles first in the bottom of the jar. And after about 24 hours, you get the silt to settle. And I think it's 72 hours for the clay to settle. And it will settle in distinct layers, like a terrarium with different colors of sand in it. You will see these layers, and you can measure the total distance, and you can divide by each layer. And for purposes of discussion, so it's easy to understand, if you had 1/3 of the bottom layer, 1/3 was the middle layer, and 1/3 was that top layer, you'd have about 33% sand, 33% silt, and 33% clay. And then you follow each one across this triangle to see what type of soil do you have. And if you did say 30, 30, 30, if you look at this chart, you're looking at, oh, I clicked, sorry. You're looking at somewhere around clay loam, right? So loam is what every gardener dreams of. Loam is what every book says the plants like. Well-drained soil, that's loam. You don't need loam to have a perfect garden. Just end up pretty loamy after a while. Physical testing, so physical properties, again, you can send off for testing. You can pay someone to test it for you, but the jar test is a pretty accurate way to look at it without getting the minute soil test, say, lab or one of the universities that still does soil testing. Not all the universities still do soil testing. It's usually in their cooperative extension department, which is a great segue into soil testing. Finding out properties of soil. University of Delaware still does it, and it's very economical, pretty good turn time. And that's when we're doing soil testing at like the University of Delaware. You want to follow the directions that they give you. They give you a little package, right? You can order it through their website. Sometimes the local garden centers have those little packets, but you want to follow the directions. And so you want to take the soil samples from the garden area in question. If you take some from underneath your grass and some from your vegetable garden and some from your native perennial bed, those are 3 different areas, and they really should have 3 different tests because the recommendations that will come back are different for those 3 areas. So make sure to check the correct box for the area that you're testing on the form, right? Because otherwise you're just going to get recommendations for how to grow potatoes and corn, and most likely you want recommendations for growing ornamental plants or turf grass or vegetables. There are different types of tests. If you went with, for example, the University of Delaware and the Cooperative Extension Program, that's going to be what's called a Malic 3 test, which is a test for in-the-ground soil. Some places and labs will do this saturated paste test. Saturated paste extract will tell you what's water soluble and available to the plants, but it doesn't give you the whole nutrient profile. And that Malic 3 test is the one that will get you things like the organic matter content, the cation exchange capacity of your soil. It gives you more data. So both are useful information, but there are different types of soil tests at these labs. So biological testing is available. It is honestly fairly expensive. There are more and more new techniques and suppliers coming out all the time, which is very exciting that you can test biology in your soil with a relatively easy home test kit. Now, these are pretty new on the market. I haven't worked with any of them enough to recommend any of them yet, but there are some really unique ones coming to market right now. So, and then you can determine what your soil needs based on the testing, because if you need a lot of calcium, you wouldn't know by looking at it. You can't tell, but the soil test will tell you. And then you can get more calcium into your soil. You can take action and choose amendments based on that need. But this is a soil test report. This is done by J.R. Peters. They're up in Allentown. We like J.R. Peters. And it tells you things like soluble salts, pH, and then after that, it's the whole list of nutrients that come. Soluble salts, your EC, that is the salt content, but it's not table salt, it's the nutrients. When we talk about nutrients in soil, we refer to them as salts in general. So they're water soluble, they are the nutrients, and so it's EC means electrical conductivity. So salts impart an electrical conductivity into water. So this soil tests out at 1.67, which is not low, not high, even though it says it's, you know, that the next one, pH, it says it's on the high side, but technically it's not that high. It's pretty much right in the middle. Soluble salts of 1.6 is really good for growing plants. pH is important because pH affects nutrient availability. This pH is showing at 6.5, which even though it says it's on the high side, 6.5 is a really beautiful pH. Most nutrients are fully available at that. That's 6.5. Anywhere from 6 to 7 is pretty good in soil, quite honestly. Our soils on the East Coast are a bit more acidic just because of environmental conditions. A long time ago, you may have heard of acid rain on the East Coast. And yes, rain is slightly acidic. And so hence our East Coast plants tend to generate more acidic soils. But this has a fair amount of nitrogen, a fair amount of phosphorus, potassium. So the list goes on and on. So when you get this test back, you can see, oh, well, actually, look, my results here are pretty good. I'm missing maybe some magnesium, maybe some iron, and some of the other micronutrients. But overall, this soil is providing nutrients to the plants that they need. And maybe I need a little magnesium. So you could choose a soil amendment that was high in magnesium to supply that necessary plant nutrient. And in reality, because calcium's not really high, I would probably just choose a CalMag supplement for this soil to give the plants more calcium and magnesium, which is really two of the things that are lacking in this soil sample, this one example. So soil pH, some people, this can be very mystifying. Wow, what is my soil pH and what does that have to do with anything? Well, for those of you that are hydrangea lovers, you may have put aluminum sulfate on them to turn them blue. And that's because it will aluminum sulfate, when applied to soil, will acidify the soil. And as you change pH from neutral, which is 7, down to 5s, etc., you're going to get that more deep blue color from pH. Very scientifically, it's a measure of the hydrogen ions present in the soil. But soil pH influences nutrient availability. That's really what it comes down to. It's a range from 0 to 14. 0 is highly acidic and caustic. Like coffee has a pH of 5, right? Muriatic acid is down near 3. Very, very caustic. And 14 is highly basic or alkaline. And baking soda, for example, has a pH of 9, and that's a commonly known cleaner, right? So if you go up more in pHs, they can be not good for your skin. And this is why, soil has a pretty tight range in between about 6 and 7. In the Midwest, it creeps up above 7, so it depends on where you are. But 7 is neutral. Potting soils typically have a lower pH range, recommended from 5.5 to 6.5. Soils, again, 7 to 6 is okay. And the highest nutrient availability is in between those ranges. Nutrients are still available outside those ranges, but some of the nutrients are less available. So the plant can start to show deficiencies if you have a very high pH or a very low pH due to any number of factors. But it does vary by region because it varies by the plant material, the parent material that it's made from. You can add amendments to affect pH. This is a long process. Aged pine fines would be the #1 recommendation I have if you need to drive your pH down in your garden. It takes a while, but it will drive the pH down. You can increase soil pH by adding a soil amendment like lime or calcitic lime or dolomitic lime. Dolomitic lime has both calcium and magnesium. Calcitic lime only has calcium. So depending on your soil test, you can make a decision to use one or the other based on the nutrients that you have or need. I already mentioned about aluminum sulfate can be used to decrease pH. Sulfur can also be used. Granulated sulfur can be used to decrease soil pH. That's more fast. So those two are fast acting. Aluminum sulfate, very fast acting. Sulfur takes a little longer because it's microbially mediated. Still acts pretty quick. The aged pine bark is the slowest to act, but it can be the most economical and easy way over time to change soil pH. Most plants can live in that range between 6 and 8. Some plants even like it down near 5, like all the beautiful rhododendrons at Jenkins Arboretum. They prefer a slightly acidic soil. Any of the ericaceous plants that are in that plant family, Ericaceae, that's all the rhododendrons, but it's also blueberries, heaths, and heathers. They like a little more acidity. So when it comes to the biology, though, the way I remember it, so bacteria prefer basic soils. Fungi prefer the opposite, acidic soils. So it's BB, bacteria like basic soils, fungi like acidic soils. And turf, usually turf grasses, like slightly more basic soils, and that is like turf is bacterially dominated soil, and our perennial gardens, vegetable gardens, they like a balance of bacteria and fungi in the soil. And trees are more of fungi dominated soils, and that's why our forest soils are more acidic than our landscape soils. A lot of concepts in this slide, but I'm going to keep moving. Soil EC, looking at the soil test again, EC means the electrical conductivity, which is the amount of fertilizer present. It is like salt, meaning it's nutrients that have dissolved in the water. So a good soil test, one from the University of Delaware, for example, will show pH, EC, organic matter, and list the amount of each plant required nutrient present. It's not going to tell you all the nutrients under the sun, but it'll tell you about the plant required nutrients. Your soil EC should really be between 0.5 and 4 on that scale. If you recall, we saw an EC of 1.6, which I said was good for most plants. Young plants cannot tolerate high salts. They need lower soil ECs. Adult plants can tolerate high, but 4 is very much on the high side. A lot of times you would never see it go above 2 or 3 is even a high level. 4 is extremely high. That would be very hungry plants like vegetable gardens, tomatoes, peppers, things like that, that just, and C4 plants that just eat nutrients and will take in as many as they can get. And a highly organic or clay soil, you will definitely see a higher electrical conductivity as compared to sandy soils. Sandy soils have a lower electrical conductivity because they don't have the ability to hang on to the nutrients as well. Because the organic matter content is generally lower in sandy soils, and so it won't have as high of an electrical conductivity. The sandy soils can't hang on to it as well. Nutrients versus organic matter. This is a big one because a lot of people think they can just throw fertilizer at their plants to improve their plant growth. That's not always the case. We need the organic matter in the soil. Nutrients are grouped into macronutrients and micronutrients. We're going to talk about nutrients first. And we've probably heard a lot of these things talked about over the years as gardeners, but NPK, those are the classic 3 you see on every bag of fertilizer. And it doesn't matter if it's a 464 or whatever the numbers are. Those numbers you see on the bag represent the nutrients that are needed the most by plants. There's 3 big ones that no one ever talks about because they're given to the plant by nature. No one ever talks about the 3 that plants need the most, which are actually hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon, but those come from water and CO2, carbon dioxide. But the plants need to find the other nutrients in the soil. for the most part. Calcium, magnesium, sulfur, all very important for plants. When you talk about plants and photosynthesis, they're green because they photosynthesize, they make ATP. Nitrogen is super important because you don't have chlorophyll without nitrogen. You don't have this really unique compound, rubisco, that's in the plant, and magnesium and nitrogen come together to form rubisco, and that's essentially the site where ATP is made. The energy for the plant is made, and so plants need these nutrients to build things inside their cells. Right? These are very important, and if you're missing one, it's like the limiting factor, and the plant it'll show up as a deficiency. The plant will stop growing, or leaves will change color, and this has an indication that something's going on in the soil. Usually, it means one or more nutrients is not fully available, whether it's not present. So the micronutrients are all listed there. They're needed in much smaller quantities, but they're still necessary. It's important to look at the label when you're buying a fertilizer. If you look at every bag of fertilizer by law, has to have a section on it that tells you what's in it. If you look at the back, you might be pleasantly surprised. In the fertilizer box on the back of the bag, it'll tell you what all's in there, what the fertilizer is made from. So you can decide if you want to use the fertilizer. Some people like plant fertilizers, some people don't mind, and they use animal-based fertilizers. But it tells you in that little section what it is and how to use it. So definitely read your fertilizer labels. You might have an extra 5% calcium or 2% calcium in a fertilizer, and it's not advertised on the front of the bag, but you'll see it in that little section on the back. Organic matter is different. Organic matter is compost, pine bark. Organic matter is tested as a percent of the soil volume. Typical range would be anywhere from 1 to 10. 1% would be like in a prairie soil with low organic matter, or a sandy soil. 10% would be like a vegetable garden where it's been built up over the years. So most soils, again, this is a generalization, but most soils are about 5% organic matter is a very good number. Because for each 1% gain in organic matter, that soil can hold 25,000 gallons of plant available water per acre. A lot of water available to your plants just from adding 1% organic matter to the total. So you can add compost, you can do cover crops, reducing tillage will build soil organic matter because of the roots putting carbon into the soil. And organic matter feeds the soil microbes and increases the cation exchange capacity. So soil microbes are breaking the organic matter down all the time. There are larger critters in soil, the microarthropods, that shred the organic matter into smaller and smaller particles while they're consuming it. And then that makes it more available for the smaller microorganisms in soil. Fertilizers and soil amendments. So this is another one. Some people use them interchangeably. I don't. I like to say fertilizers are providing the plants with straight nutrition, NPK, or calcium, and sulfur, or the micronutrients. They can be quick release or slow release, depending on their origin. Something like a feather meal is a slow release nitrogen fertilizer. But something like fish emulsion, that is water soluble and available to the plants the day you use it. So if you have a plant in distress, think about going for a liquid type fertilizer because it will be faster acting on the plant because it doesn't need that microbial breakdown. Again, granulars for release nutrients over time. And, organic versus chemical fertilizers, a lot of people ask that question. The plant honestly doesn't care. It will take up either one. However, when you use chemical-based fertilizers, you start to select for certain biology in the soil because some of the soil biology can't handle the high EC, the high salt content of chemical fertilizers. And so they will either go to a resting stage or they just die off altogether. So you start to limit your diversity of microbes using chemical fertilizers. Same thing using pesticides. So organic fertilizers are generally lower in the nutrient content, but they're helping to feed the microbes and they're providing plenty of nutrition for the plant to grow. Why choose organic? We'll talk a little bit more about it later, but again, for the number one reason that soil microbial populations are less affected by organic fertilizer than they are chemical fertilizer. There's other reasons, but we could have a whole class on that too. OMRI listed products, if you're not familiar with OMRI, that's OMRI. It's the Organic Materials Review Institute. If you find any gardening product with the OMRI logo on it, you can know that if you were a certified organic farm by the USDA, you could use those OMRI listed products on your farm without losing your certification. Because honestly, organic has become a marketing word in many cases, not all, but in many cases. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the product is 100% organic as it would be for an organic farm. But in general, if you want to look for those products, look for OMRI listed products, is my point. You definitely want to choose fertilizer based on the plants you're growing. If you're growing leafy greens, you might need a little bit of nitrogen-based fertilizer, but you probably wouldn't need a very high phosphorus containing fertilizer. A lot of plants that are native, whether they're perennials, woodies, grasses, they likely won't need any fertilizer at all after year one. I always recommend people add fertilizer at planting time because you want that plant to get off to a great start. You want it to root in as fast as possible. You want it to establish, you want it to grow and look great the year after you plant it. But after that first year, the plant should find enough on its own. And there should be microbially mediated nutrients becoming available to the plant over time. When you're building soil structure and you're creating these functional soil ecosystems, the microbes do a lot of the work. I break it down into animal, vegetable, and mineral. The mineral ones are rocks that were never alive. The vegetable fertilizers, very important to the vegans and vegetarians out there. But cover crops are amazing for putting carbon in soil. So I always recommend use a cover crop in a garden, especially a vegetable garden. You should never let that soil sit bare because plants act as armor on the soil to protect the soil from compaction of rain. Rain compacts soil a lot. We don't even think about that, but it does. And if you have plants growing there, the plants will protect the soil surface when those raindrops hit and you get less compaction. If you have a lawn or any garden, only apply fertilizer during the growing season. There's even local laws now to protect the Chesapeake and other waterways that limit the amount of phosphorus in turf grass fertilizer because that extra phosphorus is not necessary and it just contributes to algal blooms. So again, this is why a soil test is important, because if your soil test comes back and all of your numbers are good, you don't have to add any fertilizer. There's no need to spend the money on it. There's no need to potentially have that fertilizer end up in a waterway. So, but soil amendments are the compost, the biochar that we talked about earlier. Those are soil amendments. Things of that nature that might affect physical properties, but can affect all the properties, physical, chemical, and biological. You can talk about raised beds, in-ground beds. These are just images of using cardboard and a tarp to kill the grass, then rake up all the grass, do the soil testing, add the amendments, add the nutrients that were required, the fertilizers that were necessary, then, dig it or till it once and then don't ever till it again. I know I said, oh, tilling is not good. When you're starting a garden, I get it. You have to get these nutrients and you have to get the organic matter into the soil. You can't get it there without tilling. So you have to do it once, but then after that, leave it alone, let the biology come back, let the structure start to rebuild, and you'll see the benefits in your plant growth. So, whether you're going 50-50 with compost and topsoil when building raised beds, or 75-25 with more compost, that's going to create a more organic matter rich environment, which can really feed the microbes. Either one of those is a good recipe for raised beds. So when you're creating a new bed, really get the soil tested, design your amendment package based on what you're lacking in the soil, whether it's calcium, magnesium, whatever it is, sulfur, phosphorus. Design that amendment package around it. And local garden centers are a great source of information. Go in there, tell them you got your soil test, you're low in calcium, you'd like an organic soil amendment or organic fertilizer to help boost the calcium in soil. And if you're lucky, they're going to have some oyster shells, powdered or ground oyster shell that you can put into the mix. There's other things you can use, but so anyway, again, till it once and then never till again. You can also air spade. So existing landscapes where tillage is not an option because you would harm the trees and plants that are there, you can always consider air spading. And if you can't even air spade, then top dressing with a soil amendment is good. If you're going to apply a fertilizer, always top dress with a soil amendment, whether it's compost or even just wood chip mulch. And because that will hold the fertilizer in place, won't let it wash away, and it'll keep it where you want it, where you put it. If you really want to dive in, you can make a nutrient management plan where you monitor your plant health. Certainly make an irrigation plan for year one. We cannot ignore that plants need water and that we must water them. And depending on the quality of our soil, we may need to water once a week or twice a week after planting until establishment. You can monitor water movement through the site. If you have standing water in an area, that's something that can be addressed through either amending the soil with biochar or compost to help break up that soil. Again, we're adding soil amendments to improve the root zone conditions. We're building organic matter. We're storing nutrients. We're storing water. We're feeding soil microbes, and we're increasing the water infiltration rates. And as a bonus, we're filtering stormwater as well before that water ends up in a waterway. Quick pictures from biochar. These little nuggets in the pictures are root zone feeder packs that we make. It's mostly biochar. But every single one of them, when I find one in the garden, because it's usually attached to the roots when you're pulling out a plant, you can break it open and see that mycorrhizal side of them. Why organic gardening? It's not just about the food. I mean, the food is important. What we eat and put in our bodies, that's important. But it's about building soil health and productivity and building environmental feedback loops. This organic gardening, when we garden organically, we're allowing nature to come in. We're allowing nature to thrive. And we have to feed the birds. And if you're spraying things to kill caterpillars, that's less food for the birds, right? Mama bird needs to find a lot of caterpillars every day for each baby bird. And so when we have these environmental feedback loops, we're allowing leaves to get munched on a little bit, and that's okay because it's feeding something that is feeding something else. So it's about the greater ecosystem, and we're a part of that when we garden organically. You're increasing nutrient water retention. You're filtering pollutants before they reach fresh water. Building the primary plant trophic level. That means you're growing leaves for other things to eat, to feed other organisms up the food chain. And it's a replenishing thing. It connects us to the natural world. There's solid scientific evidence that shows when humans go out in nature, and like I said, if you can see a tree, feel the wind on your face, touching a plant of any kind, you're in nature. And your heart rate goes down. Your ability to focus increases. These are positive things for the human body. And this has been documented over and over again. If you hadn't heard, at Cornell University, one of the most stressful universities in the country, apparently, by testing and documentation, they now have the docs on campus now prescribe nature to the students. Oh, you're feeling stressed because you're overworked. You need to go out in nature 3 times a week for a minimum of 20 minutes each time. Come back in 2 weeks and tell me how you feel. That's a real thing. It connects us to nature. It gives us the ability to just focus and calm down and enjoy some of nature. We're going to shift a paradigm together. That's what we're doing. And soil is alive. Soil is not just dirt. It's alive from the soil food web. This is a classic slide. It shows the interconnectedness of the microbial and macro organisms in soil, but it all starts with the sun and plants. Plants take energy from the sun, convert it into sugars. Those sugars get pushed into the roots, which is then pushed out as organic matter. That organic matter feeds microbes like bacteria and fungi, who are then eaten by protozoa and nematodes. And the way nutrients cycle in soils is that that protozoa, that nematode, they don't need all the nitrogen or all of the nutrients that are contained within a colony of bacteria or fungal cells. And they eject that extra fertilizer waste, and it's water-soluble nutrients that plants can take up, or that more microbes can come around and use to grow and divide and grow and divide and continue building the abundance and diversity of soil microbes. And then we go up the food web and we're feeding more and more things, as evidenced by the graphic. So it's alive. So this image is just some clover roots. So you can see the little nodules. Again, I forget if y'all can see my cursor, but there are, if you start at the top right and you come down that big root, not even before the split, there's a nodule poking out. They're very rounded. They look like a club coming off these roots. There are bacteria living in the roots of these plants, taking nitrogen out of the air and converting it into plant available forms. This is why clover is a wonderful thing to have in your turf or to have as a cover crop, because it's putting nitrogen back into the soil. Just naturally, happening naturally, no fertilizer required. The plant and the microbes are doing it together. Again, functional soil ecosystems. This is what it's all about. It's all about building soil structure, which will then suppress disease, retain moisture and nutrients for your plants, and again, induce that plant systemic response from the microbial activity. And that can be making the plant stronger, making it resist stress, no matter if that stress is drought stress, pathogen of some kind, powdery mildew. A good, healthy soil has the microbial populations that can induce the systemic response in plants that make them stronger. So these are a couple gardens that we've installed over the years. The Catherine Doolin Folger Rose Garden outside of the Smithsonian. That is a mix that does contain biochar as part of the organic component of the soil. So the organic matter this is an engineered soil installed by a landscape crew. So it has compost and biochar, but that biochar is a big component of why this garden looks so good. I really need to go in June and get a picture of it when it's all in its glory. This obviously was in winter, but I haven't been back to DC in a while in June. And then the picture on the right is Split Rocker. That is a sculpture that is permanently on display at the Glenstone Foundation in Maryland, Potomac, Maryland, which is a beautiful post-World War II modern art museum, one of the best of its kind in the world. Amazing. Highly recommend a visit. But Split Rocker is a 30-foot tall sculpture. There's about 30,000 annuals in this thing. Half of it looks like a dino, half of it looks like a rocking horse. But the one at Glenstone, it is all organically managed. We made a special soil for it that has not been changed out now in almost a decade. 10 years of never changing the soil out, just replanting. And that soil is still fantastic, right? You think about, like, have you ever had a plant in a pot that you didn't have to do anything with for 10 years? Probably not. But that comes down to the ingredients that are in it. There are some things like calcined clay and biochar and even topsoil in this soil mix, and that's where it helps to hold that structure over time. I want to get to these questions. So again, if a fifth grader can understand it, we can get it too. And anyway, so Amy, I would be happy to talk about some of these questions in the Q&A. And then if we do have more time, I can talk about soil forever.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was amazing. And yes, we already have 4 questions. Some of them started to come in as you were talking. So happy to start this process. All right. So you got a couple when you mentioned the idea of no-till. So the first says, in a flower garden without tilling, when it is dry, a crust forms on top. What do you do at that point?
That's a great question. So that dry, crusty layer can be there for a number of reasons. I mean, number one, when let's assume that this garden has been in place and it's not brand new plants that you put in, the garden's always going to crust up when we go into a dry spell, right? Like at the beginning of this spring, we had what, 6 weeks with no rain essentially, and everyone's soil was starting to get that crusty look up top. But when the rains came back, I'm sure you noticed, oh, the soil looks all uniform again and everything is fine. So one thing you could do would be to add a mulch layer that will protect the soil itself. And then the mulch layer would be the one drying out and the soil would stay more moist underneath there. So you won't get that crusting action as much. So definitely mulching, I would recommend. And then the type of mulch is a little bit aesthetic. It's a little bit of a personal choice thing. But aged pine fines does give a nice earthy look, and it is either aged pine fines or compost are my two favorite mulches, hands down. Wood chips are great, especially for wood chips are usually free or can be, and they're great. You're gonna apply them at a deeper level to get the same amount of moisture control in the soil. But my biggest recommendation would be mulch to decrease that amount of crusting that's going on. It could mean that there's a high salt content in the surface of the soil because high salts in this very surface will exaggerate the crusting effect. But again, a mulch layer to hold that moisture in the soil so that it's the mulch that's drying out, not the topsoil underneath. That would be my best recommendation.
That's great advice. Sticking on the no-till train here, what if you're not supposed to till, what am I to do with winter cover crops that I put in my vegetable garden?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the type of cover crop we use can be affected by that. So anyone that's ever tried like winter rye in their garden knows you have to till that. You have to rip it up and flip it over. There's just no other way. Otherwise, it's just like grass in your garden. There are some cover crops that aren't so hardy, like a combination of oats and peas are a great cover crop, and they are not winter hardy. They'll die in the winter, and you can just push them down, smash them down. You can use a string trimmer to break them up. The farmers use a technique called crimping, where they roll this machine forward and it just crimps that organic matter down on the surface. And then they have drill seeders, et cetera, that plant the seed of the plant as it moves. But so buckwheat is another fantastic cover crop for our region, and it is winter killed, so it's super easy to knock it down with, depending on how big your garden is, your own hands. A string trimmer will knock it back down to that stubble layer, and then you can plant right in the stubble layer. It can look a little more messy. I embrace the little bit of messiness in my garden. So it's not for everyone. And what you can do if you do a winter cover crop, you can always knock it down and then add a fresh layer of compost or pine bark on top so it looks clean and nice and crisp again. That's an option. I like leaving up my perennials in winter so that all the little insects that live in there will still be alive the next spring, as opposed to cutting them all down and putting them in my compost pile. So it's to each their own, but yes, I hear you. A lot of those like daikon radishes and those type of deep, cover crops that can break up the compaction in the soil, they'll break down on their own. You don't have to till them in. But I know some of those cover crops are perennial. Some of those cover crops are a lot more hardy. They're not winter killed, and those are tough. Those you almost do have to till or to get them down in. But there are good options for our area that aren't ryegrass. That makes a lot of organic matter, and that's great. But I would recommend in that case maybe try one of these other options for cover crops, like the oats and peas or buckwheat.
Great. So someone's just looking for a little bit of clarification with, again, the no-till. So to add amendments to an established garden bed, do you just add it to the top and not mix it in?
So you want to get those nutrients into soil, and you can do a bit of a surface tillage. So there are tools made for that type where you're really only digging it into the scratching it in is another way to describe it, where you're really only getting it down into like maybe the top 2 inches of the soil. And for perennial plants, there's not a ton of roots, contrary to many popular books and whatnot. They really are deeper into the soil. And even if you do break up some surface roots, the plant still has all the other roots in soil, and the microbial community is going to be throughout. There's not a whole lot of microbes in that top half inch because it's drier. So yes, you can scratch it in if it's a permanent bed, especially established bed. You can't till, don't want to till, scratch it in. Some people will do it just at planting time. So if I don't want to till my vegetable garden, you can add those amendments at planting time and put it directly in the planting hole. And that way the plant is still getting those nutrients and they're right there when those roots start growing. And then you're not tilling. So yes, putting it in the planting hole directly, or light scratching it in, maybe the top 2 inches of the soil profile, even the top inch of the soil profile. That's enough where it's there. It's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to get washed away by a storm. Maybe put a mulch layer on top of compost or aged bark or even wood chips. Straw is another common one for vegetable gardens. That will help it from getting washed away and keep it in the soil. All the nutrients move down. Gravity is taking all those nutrients down into the soil. But right, you don't necessarily just want to surface apply with nothing else, because it can wash away, wash around, or all the nutrients get washed to one side of the garden. So those are some techniques to put it and keep it where you want the fertilizer to be.
That makes a lot of sense. So from a soil vantage point, how do you feel about the concept leave the leaves?
Yes, leave the leaves, very popular. I left the leaves last fall. So I'll say a couple things on it. So one, I just bought a house last year, first house, and and they took good care of this house, but they weren't gardeners. And so they removed the leaves from this landscape for decades. And all these trees are carbon starved. You can tell they are not doing as well as they should. Big storm, we're losing big branches that are 8 inches in size. The conifers aren't doing well, and it's because they've been starved for carbon. So I encourage you to leave the leaves where you can in garden beds. Don't ever leave the leaves on your turf grass. It's going to smother the turf. That's not a good thing. If you can, shred the leaves, reduce their particle size. They will age faster and turn into the famous UK leaf mold. Leaf mold is very popular in the UK, and it's basically composted leaves. Another quick tidbit, they call potting soil compost in the UK. So if you're talking to a UK friend and they're talking about, oh yes, I plant my plants in compost, they're talking about potting soil. But leaving the leaves is great for the soil ecosystem services. You do need to know that if they're too thick, bulbs won't come up well through them, especially smaller bulbs. A thin layer of leaves, crocus are going to come up through that. But, gardeners that have seen this over and over, like if you leave too many leaves, the crocus leaves will come out and they'll look a little twisted and they won't bloom real well. But guess what? If it's leaves year after year after year, in areas that you don't have bulbs coming up, or you're not trying to encourage young seedlings to come up, it's wonderful. It's great mulch for the trees, and it keeps the carbon where it needs to be, to going back into the soil for those roots. So I encourage you to leave them where you can, especially in garden beds as mulch. Don't leave the leaves on your grass. That would not be good. Now, if you reduce their particle size and you compost them and then you put them back out on the grass, well then fantastic. But leaving the leaves is definitely recommended in ornamental landscape beds, native plant beds. Just watch that you don't cover up the crowns of your native perennials. The crown is where the plant has been planted, and that's where the stems are coming out of. That's the crown of the plant. You don't want to cover that up necessarily. But yeah, I recommend leaving them and looking for your neighbor's bags of leaves and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, free carbon for your property.
I'm curious what they say in the UK for compost.
It's also compost.
Oh, really?
Confused when I was doing my graduate research work, but called potting soil compost. But there's it depends on who you talk to. But yeah, the bags of potting soil that you would buy here, it's bags of compost.
So this next question is compost and leaf related. It says, is compost from your township collected? Sorry, I said that wrong. Is compost from township collected household leaves valuable, and how best to use?
So yes, it's valuable because it's organic matter that is available to you for free. Some of the townships do a better job than others. What you have to be aware of is that just remember that this, if your township does not mow down all the weeds all the way around the leaf composting area, that can be a problem, because then their weed problem is your weed problem, because a lot of these piles are not managed like a commercial compost pile. So they're not turned at the magic temperature that kills weed seeds and pathogens. So you may, I'm not saying you will, but you may introduce a whole bunch of weed seeds or pathogens to your property, and it's more headache than it's worth. But if you can, talk to the township, how do you manage the leaf pile? Do you turn it? Do you turn it when it reaches a certain temperature? Oh, you do. Oh, you do mow the weeds all the way around. There's questions you can ask to find out how much risk am I taking on by receiving this free stuff. And then, people have made comments over the years, well, the leaves are picked up on the roadside. Doesn't that mean they're grabbing little bits of oil or other contaminants? I mean, these operations where they take and compost leaves, there's dog toys, there's tennis balls, there's cans, there's all kinds of trash present in it. I haven't ever seen a leaf compost done by a municipality where there was a significant amount of the PAH compounds that would, or oils or things like that. The biggest concern I see with the municipal compost operations is that you can get a lot of weed seed in that. And in general, we're talking about boroughs, municipalities that are picking up the leaves curbside in their district, in their region, and composting them at one facility. Some of the other facilities, it depends on the borough. They may take yard debris from homeowners. And if so, what if somebody just dug up all the crabgrass that went to seed and they took it to the composting facility and it didn't get cooked, and now all of a sudden you got a whole bunch of crabgrass or Phragmites or whatever it is. So it's kind of a buyer beware, or acquirer beware. But just to have a conversation with the borough and ask them how they do it. That's the best way to know. And if they're turning when temperatures hit at least 131 or 150 degrees, then they are cooking out all of the weed seeds and pathogens. Again, those magic numbers are in between 131 and 150. If they get that hot, they're cooking out the weed seeds and the pathogens, and you wouldn't have to worry about it. And that means they're doing a good job.
So there's another question about weeds, and asking about, are there any soil amendments or improvements in soil health? Does soil health, can that help limit weeds?
That's a good question. So there is, to mention it, there's corn gluten meal. So corn gluten meal is a weed control. Corn gluten meal stops seeds from germinating. There are some organic turf programs that are a 4-step program where corn gluten meal is one of the steps, and it's to prevent excess seed germination in soils. You have to use that corn gluten meal for about 4 or 5 years to build up the compound that is present in the corn gluten meal that actually stops the seeds from germinating. So you can do that. However, I'm partial to the plants that are planted by nature, the seeds that come in. How did this Aquilegia get here? I didn't plant it. Nature planted it. How did this beautiful cornus seedling get here? I didn't plant it. Nature. So you won't get as many of those chance encounters if you're applying corn gluten meal. But if it's important for you in a turf grass area, especially, that's why it's used in the 4-step program for lawn maintenance. Great use of it there. But in my garden, every year I let all my columbine, my Aquilegia, go to seed just so I can spread them around the garden and keep enjoying their beauty. And it's like if you have black-eyed Susans, you try to cut them down early so they don't do that because they can be aggressive. And so it depends on the plant. But I love letting plants go to seed and then spreading them around my garden. It's actually one of my greatest a friend taught me this for lettuce. Every year I grow lettuce, but I let the most beautiful lettuce go to seed each year. And then I thresh that seed in the veg garden. So those seeds just come up when they're ready. And, you do this over like 10 years and you'll start to develop, kind of almost like a very unique cultivar or strain of lettuce that does really well under your local soil conditions. So I wouldn't get that if I was using corn gluten meal. So how do you control weeds organically? Well, there's tools that are great for that. The undercut hoe, the cobra head, there's lots of different tools you can use for that. So it does require a little elbow grease, but mulch is fantastic. If you mulch, you're mulching over the weeds. You won't have the weed seeds germinating. So in an ornamental garden bed, wood chips are great for a deep mulch when you're trying to get weed control. And in a vegetable garden, straw is great for that. You don't want to use wood chip as mulch in a veg garden. It's too much woody material for it. So that's a couple ways to control them organically. There are organic weed control sprays. Vinegar, everyone talks about vinegar and horticultural vinegar. That's a tricky one because if you use it, you're going to change the pH of your soil. And in the cracks in your sidewalk, no big deal. But in your garden beds, that's not good. It can really burn plants. But there's other organic weed controls that are coming out. Some are, multiple applications to get a poison ivy plant to die, but they're based on oils like cinnamon and clove oil and citric acid. So there are some coming out, and there's some really cool ones coming out that oh gosh, the knotweed that is an invasive plant around here. You see it around the waterways a lot, and there's actually an herbicide that's being made from that, I believe, by Marone Bio Innovations. But products like that. This is why the plant world is so amazing. There are compounds out there that would probably just eat weeds for breakfast, and we just haven't found them and commercialized them yet. And thankfully, companies are looking for them. So hopefully there'll be more and more that come on the market that make it easier for gardeners to stay organic and control weeds, especially bigger established ones. But mulching is a great way. Little elbow grease. I know no one wants to hear that, but it's true. And staying on top of them when they're young. Don't forget, the best time to pull the weed is when they're this big, because you can just get it pretty quick with an undercut hoe or another tool. It's just when they get big, they're super annoying. I mean, believe me, I have tons of weeds. I mean, I've got to get out there and deal with it. I've just been way too busy. But it's part of gardening. And then also there are in ecological gardening circles, if you have a lot of, like, I have a lot of stilt grass I have to deal with on this property. And there are definitely, there's a movement afoot to never pull a weed, always whack it back. Because when you pull the weed out of the ground, guess what? You just unearthed a whole bunch more weed seeds that came to the surface, and they'll germinate and grow. Whereas if you keep knocking it back and knocking it back by some mechanical method, eventually the plant will get exhausted of its resources and it won't come back. Or you can knock it back to the point where you can mulch it and it'll die because it's just so weak from the using all of its root resources to produce more shoot growth. So there's definitely a movement afoot to do that. And in talking with, I'm trying it on my property. So I'm trying it with stilt grass. I'm trying areas where I pull and areas where it's not very established yet. And then I'm trying areas where all I'm doing is just whacking it back, and we'll see what happens.
This is so much great information, Mark. Thank you so much. But just to clarify before people go rummaging through their pantries after this presentation, You're saying corn gluten meal, which is very different from cornmeal.
Yes,
Yes.
100%, very different. Yeah. And another, this is random, but hey, if you want to increase the fungal content of your compost, which usually our composts are more bacterially dominated, you can add things like oats, literally steel cut oats to your compost, and it will feed the fungi, and the fungi numbers will grow in the compost. So you have to do that about 2 weeks or more before you're applying the compost. But one bag of steel cut oats, a couple pounds, it can treat a very large pile of compost because you don't need much to feed them. So you can add straw and oats to a compost pile to turn it more fungally, to balance it out, as you will, because yeah, again, you could talk about this for days, and I do teach other classes that are much more detailed, where we do the deep dives and we go into all the details about all the bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, the microbes that do the work in soil. But that's the beauty of life. There's so much more to learn. And I know that Amy asked me for a resource section, which you all can access. Highly recommend checking that out. Some great books and website resources to spend the weekend mulling over, maybe get a couple of them, whether it's Audible or from your local library or whatever. Like, there's some really good books in that list. Hey, the Jeffrin Public Library, right? I bet you they have some of these books.
They probably do. Yes. And so I will be building out the resource links that Mark sent along with the recording of the presentation. And I'll send that link to everyone so you guys can all check that out, hopefully early next week. Mark, if you're up for it, there's one question I would love to hear your answer on, which is, can soil compaction be a natural occurrence, or is it mostly man-made?
Yeah, that's a great question. So soil compacts a little bit when it rains, but it's not the same thing as driving a vehicle over a garden area, or even us walking on the garden area. Now, anyone that's ever walked in the woods knows that the forest floor is spongy. You feel that sponginess when you're walking through the woods and that duff layer on a trail. And that's because it has excellent soil structure. So it can have some give from your foot, but as soon as you step off of it, it's going to raise back up again because it has that rebounding ability because of all the structure and the organic matter in the soil. Can compaction happen naturally? Usually it is because of humans. We compacted it one way or another, whether it's machines and equipment, and it could have happened a long time ago. Let's say you move into a new house. Oh, it's been 5 years. Why do I still have this ponding water area on my property? It's because of compaction. If action is not taken to improve the soil structure, it's just going to stay that way. And it takes a really long time for the microbes to get back in there and literally push those particles apart, create structure again. Because it happens at it happens, at the smallest level of bacteria, but then it's also earthworms moving through soil and mites moving through soil and pushing aside particles. So, naturally occurring, usually not, unless that there was a water occurrence that happened, like a flood can compact soil because water is very heavy. But in general, if you're lucky, the water has already filled those pore spaces, and so it's not going to compact. But usually compaction is a human-made problem. But the good news is that you can add some soil amendments, compost, biochar, and others to alleviate that compaction, because it's all about, you have to bring the biology back. When you have compacted soil, the biology is not good because there's no airspace. There's no airspace, nothing can breathe. So it's not good for roots. It's not good for microbiology of soil. So yes, it can happen, especially with rain on bare soil. And that's why I recommend the cover cropping. When you think about it, the soil that covers the earth, it's like the skin of the earth. It's almost like an organ of the earth, and it has to breathe. And so when we take care of it, when we build the soil structure, when we add organic matter to increase the abundance and diversity of the microbes, it's working to our favor because we're working with nature instead of working against nature.
So if you wouldn't mind just chatting about your company here at the end. Someone actually noted that they think that Organic Mechanics moved and wondered where you were located now.
Yeah, so thanks. So I still live in Chester County in Kennett Square. The company's headquarters is here in Kennett Square. We were in Modena, Pennsylvania, which is just south of Coatesville, along the Brandywine. It was idyllic, but we got flooded way too many times. And Hurricane Ida was the last straw and nearly put us out of business. So we had to move. And we looked all over, everywhere within 2.5 hours of this area. And commercial real estate is at a premium right now, partly due to post-pandemic. So many companies are online. They all need storage space and warehouses. And so anyway, we did find a new facility. It's actually outside of Richmond, Virginia. But lucky for us, I negotiated. We can ship stuff up here to all our retailers for the same price as if we were still in Modena. So it didn't really affect that too much, which is nice. But yeah, Organic Mechanics Soil Company, our stuff is sold at garden centers and natural food stores. It's used by landscape companies and landscape design installers. And we sell to public gardens and et cetera, all up and down the East Coast. Mostly from New York to DC, but we do ship product all the way to Maine and down to Florida, and just like all the other soil companies, we primarily East Coast though, but they're all organic, mostly unrelisted, heat-free, lots of beneficial biology from compost or worm castings. We use biochar in some of our mixes. So yeah, that's kind of it in a nutshell. Organicmechanicssoil.com is the place to go to look at our products and read the blog and sign up for the newsletter, do all the fun things. There's videos. You'll see me at different, the company is now, it turned 17 this year. So, you see young me in some of the videos, and then you see, long bearded me in some of the videos, but anyway, that's a good place to learn more about our products, but it's sold all over the place here. And there's a where to buy page. You can type in your zip code, see who's close. But always got to call ahead because not everybody carries everything and they don't always have it in stock. But yeah, so that's a tidbit about Organic Mechanics and where we are.
Your products are amazing. I use them often, and I'm so thankful that you've started your company and have really high quality products for gardeners. So thanks, Mark.
Yeah, this was great.
Yeah.
I hope
So
you all learned something.
Yeah, thank you for being with us tonight for sure.
Hmm.
Let's see if there's any other. All right, yeah, I think we're good. So yes, Mark, again, thank you so much for being with us. And for those of you who are still with us, I just want to put a quick little plug in for our third Thursday lecture for next month, which will be Thursday, September 21st. And we'll be diving into the pollination ecology of pawpaw, which is one of our native trees that produce edible fruits. So hopefully you guys can join us for that. And thanks for being a part of Arboretum, those of you who are out there who have been joining us this summer. And hopefully we'll see you all soon. All right, good night, everybody.